How often have we heard that all this additional carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is stimulating plant growth and therefore creating more oxygen for us? And also the resulting warming is generally good for us. This video is going to take a look at the pros and cons of adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere and see whether it's a net positive or a net negative. Remember when we were told that things that were good for us turned out to be bad for us? A prime example is this.
You know, if you were to follow a busy doctor as he makes his daily round of calls, you'd find yourself having a mighty busy time keeping up with him. Time out for many men of medicine usually means just long enough to enjoy a cigarette. And because they know what a pleasure it is to smoke a mild, good-tasting cigarette, they're particular about the brand they choose.
As early as the 1950s, the tobacco companies were aware that smoking caused cancer and nicotine was addictive. However, when the medical community raised the alarm, what was their reaction? They created a disinformation campaign to undermine the science. Does this sound familiar or what? The fossil fuel companies knew that carbon dioxide emissions were changing the climate as early as the 1970s. What was their reaction when the climate community raised the alarm? It was to create a disinformation campaign to undermine the science, rather like the cigarette company. Here's an example.
Some of these so-called experts turn out to be very, very good at it.
I'm not a scientist, although I do play one on TV occasionally. Hell, more than occasionally.
It creates a whole new cast of characters, these people who become well known for casting doubt on global warming.
Catastrophic global warming is a hoax.
There's no scientific consensus.
You go up against a scientist, most of them are very hard to understand and very boring.
In other words, they employ a bunch of slick PR men to create the impression that there is a counter-argument in the scientific community, when that is in fact not the case. Then they send in the clowns. These people fill the airways, the newspapers, TV stations and social media with sciencey sounding arguments, conspiracy theories and unsupported accusations against scientists. Their sole purpose is to create more doubts in the mind of the public. So one side says that carbon dioxide is a plant food, another side says it's a pollutant. And in fact, they're both right to some extent. However, what we need to do here is to look at the pros and cons of each and see whether the pros outweigh the cons or vice versa. We've all heard that more carbon dioxide makes larger plants, but bigger is not necessarily better. We've all seen experiments like this where plants are grown under different conditions of carbon dioxide, slowly increasing from the ambient condition to nearly doubling it, and you see the size of the tree does in fact increase. But this is only the case for some plants, not all plants. And the plants under these experimental conditions have the right composition for the soil, the right amount of light, the right amount of water and temperature. Now, if the increased carbon dioxide affects any one of those factors, like the amount of soil moisture or the ambient temperature, then those growing conditions may not be so optimum as the current ones. Most plants alive today evolved in conditions where the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was between 150 and 270 parts per million. We don't know what their reaction is going to be to a much higher level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Some may flourish, others may not. Also, the nutritional value of a plant is not affected by the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The nutritional value is gained from the soil. So you might get a watermelon that's twice as large, however the amount of nutrition in it for the human being that's eating it is the same. So you're going to have to eat twice as much watermelon to get the same nutritional value as you did with the old one. As the argument that increased carbon dioxide is increasing plant growth is one of the most common of the arguments used in favor of more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, I felt we should go into this in a little bit more detail. Plant growth requires more than just carbon dioxide. It requires sunlight. It requires water. Now the problem is that with increased carbon dioxide you're getting increases in global temperatures, and that's changing the precipitation patterns that we're seeing in the weather. So some areas are getting extended droughts, and that surely doesn't help growing conditions. Other areas are getting floods, and that harms the productivity of plants as well. And what we're getting is extended dry periods punctuated by downpours. That doesn't help plant growth at all. With a lack of rain in some areas, seawater is encroaching onto the aquifers and killing plants from below, as is seen in this forest here. As I said, nutrients aren't changed by the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We also rely on pollinators to produce most of the fruit and vegetables that we have. And a lot of those pollinators are under threat, particularly the honeybee recently. And some of the problems with the honeybee has been laid at the door of global warming. Also, we've had increase in certain types of pests, pine beetles, for example, and these stink bugs. I'd never seen stink bugs in the area of Washington, D.C. before, but now they're very, very common. Fruit trees, for example, often require a hard frost during the winter in order to help their fruit to set. If that doesn't happen, you don't get so much fruit. Whereas cultivated plants may be doing slightly better, weeds do a lot better. So as far as carbon dioxide is concerned, it's neutral as far as changing the amount of sunlight and the amount of nutrients in the soil. It sort of helps growing with some plants, if not a majority of the plants. But it hurts the water supply, the pollinators, it changes the temperatures, the soil conditions, and the effectiveness of pests and invasive species. So all in all, this extra carbon dioxide and the temperatures that it is creating is a negative effect on plants. Fortunately for us, about a quarter of the carbon dioxide we emit is absorbed by the oceans. This is resulting in the oceans becoming more acidic. As carbon dioxide has increased in the atmosphere, the pH level of the oceans has dropped. This leads to the death of yet another climate myth, that in fact the oceans are responsible for the increasing carbon dioxide through warming temperatures. Each year, the oceans emit 90 gigatons of carbon dioxide. However, they absorb 92 gigatons of carbon dioxide. And that's why the pH is falling. For example, corals are bleaching as a result of a combination of lower pH in the water and warmer water temperatures. Many small shellfish cannot properly form their shells as the pH of the water increases. And the food chain is beginning to become disrupted. Animals at the bottom of the food chain, like krill, are becoming stressed, and so therefore there are fewer of them to feed the rest of the fish in the sea. Another popularly used argument is that new land will become available for farming. The most usual places pointed to are northern Canada and Siberia. Unfortunately, the soils there are poorer than the normal arable land, so will be less productive. Also, the growing season is much shorter. The problem is, as such lands become available, the lands to the south will become less available. So semi-arid areas, now farmed, will become less productive. Examples of this would be the Central Valley of California and Sub-Saharan Africa. The Central Valley of California is responsible for the majority of fruits and vegetables consumed in the United States. It also produces, for example, 90% of the world's almonds. So all in all, this will have far more negative effects than positive effects. Another argument that is often used is that the death rates fall when the temperatures are higher. And indeed, if you look at the figures, the death rate in winter is 15% higher than in summer. However, that doesn't always necessarily have anything to do with temperature. When you compare death rates based purely on temperature, you get the reverse effect. In another data point, the World Health Organization estimates that about 150,000 people are dying each year unnecessarily from the effects of global warming. Another argument is that the warming caused by the increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will open up the Arctic to more development. One of the lures of this is the so-called Northwest Passage, where ships can travel directly from Europe to Asia over the polar regions. Also, the possibility of more oil and gas development opportunities in that area. But of course, then what we really need is more greenhouse gases pumped into the atmosphere to melt the tundra and release more methane, which is a much more harmful greenhouse gas. You can see here on the right what happens when permafrost starts to melt and houses start to sink. It's really sad when you can actually set fire to the ice due to methane release. Of course, we've already seen examples of geopolitical destabilization with military forces being sent up into the Arctic by the United States, by Russia, Canada, and so on. There are a lot of fuss being made about melting glaciers, and the answer from the fossil fuel industry is, so what? But 90% of the Earth's glaciers are retreating. Here are some of the rates from the glacial retreat, and you can see that they're quite remarkable, like 100 feet per year, some over 200 feet per year. But not only that, many of the glaciers are collapsing, i.e. thinning. This plot shows the thickness of a glacier 17 miles away from the head of the glacier, and you can see it has dropped by over 10 meters in just 8 years. That's a lot of ice loss. And the so what part is, over 1.5 billion people in the world rely on glacial melt for their fresh water supply. So without those glaciers, what are they going to do? Some say we're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction. 30% of amphibian species are under threat of going extinct. 12% of bird species. 21% of fish species. Over 20% of mammals. And the most frightening statistic of all, 68% of plant species are in threat of going extinct. And remember, all of the rest of the above rely on those plants for their sources of food. One of the arguments against doing anything about global warming is it's going to have a major economic impact. And indeed, it will actually cost some jobs in the fossil fuel industry. There are more cleaner, safer and better jobs in the development of renewable energy sector than there are in the fossil fuel sector. We can see that migration, insurance and infrastructure damage costs are continuously increasing as the impacts of global warming increase. At the moment, each one of us is paying over $1,200 a year as a result of global warming. It has been found by many economic studies that the cost of mitigating anthropogenic global warming is much less than allowing it to go unabated. Finally, let's put to rest this idea that because there's more carbon dioxide in the air, the plants are producing more oxygen for us. In fact, it's the exact reverse. Because the extra carbon dioxide in the air is coming from the burning of fossil fuels, we're having to use up oxygen to create that carbon dioxide. So the amount of carbon dioxide has increased by the same amount as oxygen has decreased. So we now have less oxygen to breathe than we would have otherwise. So the next time you hear somebody telling you that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is good for us, or that there's a net positive for warming of the planet from global warming, please call them on it and post a link to this video. Until next time, goodbye.